So our next speaker is Dr. Kristen Purrington. Kristen, if you want to go ahead and share your slides. Okay, great. So Dr. Purrington is an assistant professor at Wayne State University and the Karmanos Cancer Center. She received her master's in statistics and PhD in epidemiology from the University of Michigan in 2010 and did a postdoctoral fellowship in health sciences research at the Mayo Clinic. Her current research focuses mainly on ER positive and HER2 negative breast cancer and colorectal cancer and racial disparities in them. Much of her research utilizes data and biospecimens from the Detroit Research on Cancer Survivors, or ROCS cohort study, which is an NCI-funded prospective cohort study of African Americans recently diagnosed with breast, prostate, colorectal, and lung cancers. Her talk title today is Area Level Socioeconomic Disadvantage and Racial Disparities in Cancer in Metropolitan Detroit. So I'll go ahead and hand it over to you, Kristen. Thanks.
Thanks so much, Maureen. Excuse me, I'm losing my voice a little bit here, but yeah, I'm really excited to talk to you all today about some of the work that we've been doing in Detroit. And to start us off, I want to take a second to talk about the cancer experience specifically in metropolitan Detroit and specifically racial disparities in cancer in Metro Detroit specifically. So I am at KCI in Detroit, which is situated in Southeast Michigan here. But the KCI catchment area actually consists of 46 counties throughout the state of Michigan, because we now have, I think it's 15 different satellite locations throughout Michigan. But most of what I'm going to be talking about today is going to be focusing on data coming out of Southeast Michigan. Again, where KCI Detroit is located. And this graph on the right is really showing, highlighting the racial and ethnic minority populations that are most predominant in our catchment area of Southeast Michigan. So you can see that overwhelmingly, the most predominant racial and ethnic minority population in Southeast Michigan is Black or African Americans. So that's going to be the focus of much of what I'm going to be talking about in the context of racial disparities today. So we can take a closer look at geographic and racial differences in cancer incidence and mortality, specifically in Metro Detroit, particularly compared to how that looks sort of based on the experience in the United States overall. So in the graph on the left, if we actually first just take a look at the comparison between cancer incidence and mortality rates in Southeast Michigan compared to the United States. So Southeast Michigan is in the sort of darker bars here, and the United States overall is in the green bars. But you can see that generally speaking, there's actually higher incidence and higher mortality for most of these common cancer sites in Southeast Michigan compared to the United States overall. And that effect is actually even more exaggerated when we specifically look at cancer incidence and mortality in the city of Detroit, where you can see these really striking differences, particularly for prostate cancer and lung cancer, for both incidence and mortality. So you, excuse me, you might be thinking, knowing that residents of Detroit are predominantly African American, how does this actually translate to racial differences in cancer incidence and mortality? And it sort of plays out how you would expect. Excuse me, where you are seeing that we have higher incidence and mortality rates for most common cancers for African Americans compared to whites in our catchment area. And that generally speaking, not only are these differences, these racial differences pretty striking, but for many cases, including lung and colon cancer, that we see that the experience in metropolitan Detroit is worse than in the overall sort of US population. So why do these racial disparities exist? And I know, this is a really complex question, and that Dr. Wynn and others today have already, really kind of tackled this issue and thinking about it. And the way we need to think about it, of course, is first to address the fact that race is a social construct. So there are lots of different components that are correlated with and contribute to racial categories. So specifically with respect to racial disparities in cancer, we can think about things across the spectrum of socioeconomic factors like access to quality healthcare, environmental factors ranging anywhere from pollution to sort of neighborhood resources and quality, societal factors like structural racism and medical mistrust, cultural and psychological factors. And then of course, I think what gets a lot of attention is this idea of biology underlying racial disparities in cancer. And particularly, I think the thought that kind of goes along with that is genetics and ancestry, even though, excuse me, genetics and ancestry is often, a very imperfectly correlated with the definition of race as sort of a social construct again. So again, I think that traditionally a lot of people have sort of thought about this complex problem as each of these factors individually contributing to racial disparities in cancer, but particularly in our group and increasingly sort of in the community and the literature, we're really appreciating the degree to which each of these factors contribute to sort of underlying biology of racial disparities in terms of somatic changes as well, and really understanding that interplay between these other sort of social factors and how that might be changing underlying sort of biology of tissue or other sort of biological processes might be influencing racial disparities in cancer. Excuse me. And I think a really great example of this comes out of actually Dr. John Carruthers' group from here at University of Michigan, and looking at the Emass phenomenon in colorectal cancer. So this is the elevated microsatellite alterations at selected tetranucleotide repeats phenotype in colorectal cancer, which is conceptually a little bit similar to the idea of microsatellite instability, where you have differences in the lengths of these tetranucleotide repeats between normal and tumor tissue, which is a result of defects in mismatch repair. But Emass is unique in that, we definitely are looking at different sites, but also this is very specifically due to somatic defects or dysregulation of MSH3 specifically. And it's been pretty well described now that this phenotype and that dysregulation of MSH3 is really initiated by chronic inflammation. So there are two interesting points that come out of that. First, that this is seen much more commonly in Blacks or African Americans. I think it's about twice as common in African Americans with colorectal cancer compared to non-Hispanic whites, and that this is associated with much poorer survival. So we're definitely seeing sort of evidence here of this inflammation-initiated phenotype relating to differences in actual cancer phenotypes within different racial groups associated with clinically relevant outcomes. So our next question might be, why is there an inflammation-initiated phenotype that's more common in African Americans with colorectal cancer? And I think, again, increasingly, our group is really interested in these hypotheses, but this has gained a lot of traction in recent years in general in the scientific community, that social determinants play a really big role in systemic inflammation over the life course that has implications for human health, ranging from cardiovascular disease to COVID-19 outcomes, as well as cancer. So how do we start to think about tackling some of these big problems and thinking about social determinants and how it interacts with biology to answer or think about some of these questions around racial disparities in cancer? And on the plus side, and sort of fortunately, we live in an era where we have a ton of access to publicly available large data sets that capture a lot of these complex social and biological issues. So one that I'm going to focus on today for much of my talk is the utilization of US Census data to capture a lot of area level metrics. And specifically, I'm going to be talking about, the Area Deprivation Index, which is a composite measure of neighborhood socioeconomic disadvantage that actually uses 17 different census measures that I think is kind of unique in that it goes beyond just addressing issues of socioeconomic status and also brings in some information about housing quality. So things like running water and access to transportation and things along those lines. So I think it does a better job of actually capturing some of those different sort of social factors within at the neighborhood level. So the two maps on the right here, the first, this one with the bright colors is showing the distribution of these ADI scores, or the Area Deprivation Index, throughout the Tri-County area that is captured by our cancer registry here at Wayne State. So the dark blue areas are those with the lowest socioeconomic disadvantage. So those tend to be the higher socioeconomic groups. And then the dark red areas, in contrast, are those with the highest levels of disadvantage. And so the sort of lower end of the socioeconomic scale. And I think two things really jump out from this graph. First, that you see sort of intense clustering of these neighborhoods and regions with high levels of social disadvantage in and around Detroit, and then also in the Pontiac area. And the other thing that's really striking to me is the degree to which you see sort of segregation of those areas, right? It's not just that there's a lot of mixing of red and blue throughout the map, that we really see concentration in specific areas of those areas that have the highest levels of deprivation. So then the map on the right is showing like, how does this translate to racial differences? And we're gonna dive into the details of this more, but visually speaking, this map is showing the self-reported race of residents within this tri-county area, where the green dots are those of Black or African Americans, the blue dots are those of white individuals. And unfortunately, you can see even just visually that if we were to superimpose those two graphs or those two maps, that there would be a high amount of correlation or overlap between the areas that have the largest or the highest scores for social deprivation, excuse me, and those where there are the predominant areas where African Americans live in metropolitan Detroit. So, you know, I just talked a little bit about how maybe we can get at some of the social factors using data like data from the US Census. So how do we then start thinking about, you know, integrating that with the biological part of things? And so those of us in the cancer world, particularly thinking about somatic changes, or of course thinking about TCGA, or the Cancer Genome Atlas, which is an incredible resource with thousands of samples with tons of genomic profiling. But I think something that, you know, isn't talked about in the broader scientific community enough is the vast and sort of dramatic underrepresentation of racial and ethnic minorities in TCGA. So about 80% of all of the samples that were reported as of this, I guess, was as of 2016, but I don't think a ton has changed since then, were white, with only 12% being Black or African American, and very small numbers of other racial and ethnic minorities. So I think this graph is really striking, or this figure is really striking, because it tells us not only obviously that we have underrepresentation of these groups, but how does that translate into sort of the science that we do with these data? And so this graph is showing the number of samples that we would need to detect even a 10% mutational frequency rate, which is a pretty high mutational frequency rate, in terms of surplus or deficit of samples across different cancer sites and across different racial and ethnic groups. So for white individuals, you can see pretty consistently across all cancer types, we have a surplus of samples. And of course, you know, a surplus of samples for that 10% mutational frequency rate that also translates down into having better power to detect things like rare mutations in these samples as well. But then on the flip side, as soon as you start looking at non-white or samples from non-white individuals, you start seeing that we have these really strong deficits across cancer types and across each of these different racial and ethnic groups. And of most interest to our group, of course, is looking at that deficit related to African Americans, with a couple of exceptions, like for breast, uterine, and prostate cancer. We just have a really dramatic underrepresentation of Black or African Americans in the TCGA, which makes it really difficult to do some of those analyses where we can use some of these large publicly available data sets to answer questions around social determinants of health and biology. So to start to get at some of these questions, I'm going to talk a little bit about a study that is underway now. That's the Disparities in Cancer Epidemiology study, or the DANCE study, specifically thinking about colorectal cancer. And this is a collaborative effort with Dr. Laura Rosick and Dr. Elena Stoffel at the University of Michigan, and of course my team at Wayne State University, and also with Mei-Chin Shea, who's the co-director of the Louisiana Tumor Registry, which is a SEER registry based in Louisiana at LSU in New Orleans. So and I start out by adding another layer of complexity on top of the colorectal cancer and racial disparities issue by talking a little bit about consensus molecular subtypes. So these subtypes were derived in 2015 to really sort of better capture, based on transcriptome or sort of whole transcriptome level expression profiling, sort of underlying prognosis-related features of different tumors. And the one that we're particularly interested in is the CMS4, or the mesenchymal subtype, which is by far associated with the worst relapse-free and overall survival. So in this overall study of about 3,100 tumors, about 23% of those tumors were described to be in the CMS4 subtype. So as sort of a first pass analysis, we were really interested in looking at what does this distribution look like in African Americans with colorectal cancer. So we were able to use some data from the Detroit Research on Cancer Survivors study, or the Detroit ROC study, which, as Maureen described in the beginning or before my talk, is a cohort study of more than 5,000 African African-American cancer survivors in metropolitan Detroit. And we did some pilot analyses using RNA-seq data for 34 tumors out of the Detroit Rock study, and just classified them into these consensus molecular subtypes, and saw a really immediate sort of striking difference in the distribution, particularly with respect to CMS4, compared to what has been published. And again, they didn't present in this published paper, these results in terms of race ethnicity, but these studies are predominantly composed of white individuals. So we're seeing a more than twofold increase in the prevalence of CMS4 in our African-American sample compared to this largely white sample. So this has really motivated us to continue to do this work at a larger scale, and to help kind of address that deficit in terms of research and biology being done in African Americans, to really better address the question of, are there racial differences in aggressive colorectal cancer phenotypes, but not only to address whether they exist, but to try to explore some of the mechanisms, and really specifically focusing on the relationship between race, social deprivation, chronic inflammation, and these aggressive colorectal cancer phenotypes. So for the rest of my talk, I'm going to be focusing and diving a little bit deeper into this question surrounding race and social deprivation and how that impacts cancer incidence and outcomes in metropolitan Detroit. So in order to do this, we use some data from the Metropolitan Detroit Cancer Surveillance System, which is our population-based cancer registry, again, here at Wayne State University, that captures all cases within the Tri-County area. So we identified all incident cancers from 2012 to 2016, aged 18 and older, for the four most common cancer types, so female breast, colorectal, lung, and prostate cancers. And we were able to pair that again with census level data to get population count data so we could get an incidence stratified by age, race, and sex. And so integrated with this, or together with this, we were able to get demographic, clinical, first course treatment, and follow-up data from the registry. And again, going back to that ADI measure that I was describing a couple of slides ago, we were able to calculate and map ADI to each of these, our incident cancers and the population count data, so that we could directly look at the relationship between ADI, race, and cancer incidence and outcomes. So before we really dive into sort of the meat of our analysis, this is just sort of a table and a graph that are quantifying what we were seeing in those maps a few slides ago, where we see these really striking differences in the distribution of ADI by race within metropolitan Detroit. So, just visually, you can see that the distribution looks incredibly different. We're highly right skewed for African Americans, who are much, much more likely to reside in areas with these high area deprivation indexes. And to quantify this, African Americans were more than threefold more likely to live in areas with sort of like middle levels of social deprivation, and 36-fold more likely to live in areas of high social deprivation. So really, really striking differences in even just sort of the general experiences of what these neighborhoods look like in terms of metropolitan Detroit residents. So how does this translate into cancer incidence? So we stratified our analyses specifically to look separately at non-Hispanic whites and African Americans, so that we could get a sense of whether sort of there were different patterns in how ADI was associated with cancer incidence within these different racial groups. So starting with breast cancer, and this is stratified by the four main sort of breast cancer subtypes defined by hormone receptor expression and HER2. So for non-Hispanic whites, we actually see an inverse relationship between ADI and cancer incidence, meaning that people who live in areas with more social deprivation actually have lower rates of breast cancer, specifically for hormone receptor positive, HER2 negative breast cancer. And we think that largely what is driving and what this is reflecting, which is consistent with what's been seen in the literature, is access to healthcare and access to screening and participation in screening specifically. That individuals who live in more social, highly deprived areas are less likely to get screened, and specifically less likely to have these more indolent cancers identified as a result of screening. We did not see any significant associations between ADI and the other cancer types for non-Hispanic whites. And we're already getting into some of the differences when we're now looking at breast cancer subtypes in African Americans. So in fact, we don't see any relationship between ADI and hormone receptor positive and HER2 negative breast cancer like we did for non-Hispanic whites. But in fact, we see a strong inverse relationship with ADI and triple negative breast cancer incidence. Again, part of this is probably largely driven by the fact that these cancers are more common in African Americans. But we also see sort of this interesting nonlinear relationship with triple positive breast cancer as well. So this is going to be kind of a recurrent theme, and I think thinking about and interpreting these data is obviously thinking about screening, which is really important for breast, and then we'll see that for prostate cancer as well, but also thinking about sort of the differences in, reflecting underlying risk factors, but that might be captured by differences in ADI as well. So things like BMI or reproductive risk factors like the number of children, and breastfeeding and things along those lines. So there's likely an interplay between sort of all of those things that are contributing to the differences in the patterns that we're seeing here. So again, for prostate cancer, we see this strong inverse relationship or an inverse relationship among non-Hispanic whites, again, likely reflecting increased screening among individuals with lower social deprivation. But we don't see that relationship at all among African Americans. Where in fact, if anything, it's not statistically significant, but there's actually higher rates of prostate cancer among people who live in the higher sort of social deprivation areas. And again, another sort of recurrent theme that certainly goes through my head as I think about these data is the idea that, we quantify area deprivation or social deprivation, and numerically they might be the same between different groups. But what that actually is reflecting in terms of sort of the characteristics of a neighborhood or the quality of a person's lived experience in that area is likely to be very different for non-Hispanic whites compared to African Americans who live in regions who are numerically similar in terms of ADI, but might be very different geographically and in terms of other features as well. So for colorectal cancer, we only saw an association between ADI and colorectal cancer incidence for African Americans, where there was this sort of increasing trend where higher social deprivation was associated with higher rates of colorectal cancer incidence. And we certainly did not see a linear or significant relationship for non-Hispanic whites. Went too far. But we did see it become significant for lung cancer, even though we have this, again, sort of U-shaped distribution, not linear. But what's even most striking is this incredibly strong association between ADI and lung cancer incidence among African Americans. And I didn't show it here because a lot of data and only so much time, but if we were to specifically look at young onset cancer, so individuals diagnosed under the age of 50, the difference in sort of these associations and the trajectories that we're seeing here are even more striking among young onset cancers. So it's really interesting things going on here. And this is a somewhat limited analysis because we're using registry data, so we can't pull in things like individual level data related to smoking, for example, which probably would jump into anyone's mind when thinking about social factors and lung cancer incidence, but certainly is a really interesting finding that we'd like to do some future work to try to tease apart and understand what's going on there. So in addition to the differences in sort of the patterns of association between ADI and cancer incidence, we wanted to see to what degree do we think, or do we have evidence for ADI actually mediating that relationship between race and cancer incidence? So this is looking again at each of the different cancer types for non-Hispanic whites and African Americans. On the left-hand side for each of these cancer types, this is showing the estimate of the association between race and cancer incidence. So reflecting what we would expect and basically already know, African Americans are less likely to be diagnosed with hormone receptor positive HER2 negative breast cancers, much more likely to be diagnosed with triple negative breast cancers, and also more likely to be diagnosed with colorectal, lung, and prostate cancers. So the plot on the right side for each of these cancer types is showing what happens to that estimate, so the relationship between race and cancer incidence, when we include ADI in the model. And really what we were interested in is, did it moderate the effect of race, essentially? So we did see evidence that there was significant sort of moderation of the effect of race on cancer incidence for hormone receptor positive HER2 negative breast cancer and for colorectal cancer, and a relatively modest decrease, so about 8.5% of the effect was moderated for the breast cancer subtype, and then about 7% was moderated for colorectal cancer. So as a next step, we also looked at ADI as an effect modifier. Obviously, thinking about that graph we saw a couple slides ago, looking at the difference in how ADI was related to cancer incidence, particularly for lung cancer, it's not surprising to see, in fact, that there is a strong effect modification effect for both lung and prostate cancer. So lung cancer was interesting in that the effect of race on lung cancer incidence got stronger the higher the social deprivation index went, right? So something more like a linear relationship. But prostate cancer was even more interesting, where in fact, when you kind of subdivide down and look at the effects within the lower quartiles of ADI, that African Americans were less likely to be diagnosed with prostate cancer in these lower groups, but then that flipped. And now we see higher incidence of prostate cancer among African Americans compared to non-Hispanic whites for those in the highest quartile of ADI. So again, thinking about, patterns of screening and other risk factors, but also really, I think, is indicative of the potential for this reflecting racial differences in individuals' experiences of what area level socioeconomic deprivation is and how that affects their lives. So last but not least, we're going to take a quick look at how ADI is related to cancer survival by race. So again, this is just looking at breast, colon, and lung and prostate cancer. And we looked at this both by race overall and then by race for non-Hispanic whites and African Americans. And then we also looked at overall survival and cancer-specific survival. So in general, what we're seeing from here is that ADI tends to be positively associated with increased mortality. So higher deprivation is associated with worse mortality, sort of across the board, certainly for overall mortality. Generally speaking, that is true for cancer-specific mortality, though it's a little bit attenuated for colorectal cancer and to some degree for prostate cancer. But that also, we don't see any huge striking differences in the relationship between ADI and survival by race. But then we wanted to, again, address that question of, does ADI mediate the relationship between race and survival? So again, on the left-hand side, this is just sort of the unadjusted or only adjusted for age, stage, treatment, and insurance status, the effect of race on survival, where we see that African Americans are more likely to die after they've been diagnosed with breast cancer, colon cancer, or prostate cancer. Actually, the inverse is true for lung cancer. But then what happens when we add ADI to the model? And we see much more substantial mediation or moderation of this effect than we did with incidence. So that when we account for area level deprivation, we're explaining about 50% of the overall mortality differences by race for breast cancer, and similarly for prostate cancer. So where do we go from here? So we certainly have a lot of individual components. We have established racial differences in cancer and racial differences even in tumor phenotypes. Specifically, we talked about colorectal cancer. We know or have a lot of evidence that social factors affect biological processes like inflammation, and also see that striking differences in social disadvantage by race and their impact on cancer incidence and mortality. But coming back to sort of the slide from earlier in this talk, what we need to do next, obviously, is to really pull all of this together to do a better job of really integrating these data, which is what we will be doing with our dance study, to really do a better job of accounting for each of these different things, their impacts on biology, and how that might explain racial differences in clinically relevant colorectal cancer subtypes. So with that, just lots of people to acknowledge, both collaborators here at Michigan, Wayne State and LSU, and of course, all of my people on my study team. I am happy to answer any questions.